Transparent brands demanding consumers. Now this is thoughtful. Hi, I'm Min Yu in Shanghai. From the London whale of JP Morgan to the Russians giving asylum to America's NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, if there is one thing that the recent stirring of media revelations affecting multinational businesses has taught us, it's this. There's no one aspect of business in any corner of the world which can be or should be considered confidential. Transparency is no longer a communications buzzword alone. This is the end of confidentiality and the start of a new era of full disclosure, and has serious implications for major private and public sector organizations. This is true for Chinese companies too, as they seek to build their brands overseas in the full glare of an uncensored media landscape. At the same time, Chinese consumers are demanding more honesty from Western brands coming into China. Do Chinese companies understand the need for transparency and authenticity? And how are they meeting that demand? How do overseas consumers view Chinese brands today, and how will that perception likely change in the future? We'll tackle these questions and more today on Thoughtful China, as we talk with Geoff Beattie, the Global Head of Corporate Affairs at Cohn Wolfe, which recently published 2 reports, The Age of Authenticity and From Transparency to Full Disclosure, as part of its ongoing Authentic Brands series. Geoff, thanks for coming into the studio today. First, let's start with why Cohn Wolfe wanted to do these 2 reports. What information did you think was missing from the market that you wanted to address?
Thanks very much. So we've been doing these reports on authenticity for 3 years now, and we started with just a small report just covering the UK. Last year we did 3 markets, UK, US and China, and this year we're doing 12. And the issue that we wanted to look at was we felt that there'd been 2 big changes in the world which really affected the way that companies communicate to the market. The first big change is what we call digital everything. And by that I mean the simple fact that it's just so much easier now for information to go sloshing around the world. It's so much easier for information to get out there. When I started my career as a newspaper reporter 30 years ago. It was very difficult to find out anything about companies. And if you did find out anything, the chances are that it would be difficult to get the company to actually say anything about it. These days, when every citizen with a smartphone is potentially a reporter, the amount of information that's out there about companies is just enormous. So we thought that was interesting. And the other big macro change was to do with the what we call the post-crash world, the post-financial crisis world, where there just seemed to be a lot more cynicism about companies, about the motives of companies, about what companies said and did, and how much consumers really trusted that information, how much they really believed it. So we wanted to put those 2 things together and really try and figure out how it was affecting the way that brands had to communicate to the marketplace. Was it creating the conditions where what we call authenticity in communication was going to become more important?
I think there's a misconception in the West that Chinese consumers care primarily about price. And that's not what your report is suggesting at all. Amongst Chinese consumers, we find that actually transparency and honesty of a business is even now more important than price. 79% versus 65%.
Yes. So if we go back to how we formulated this research, it's quite interesting. So we use this term authenticity, and I believe from conversations I've been having here in Shanghai that authenticity is quite a difficult word to translate into Chinese. It can mean a number of different things. So what we did for the whole study was to define our terms. We actually asked people to define authenticity for themselves. We actually said, what do you consider to be an authentic company? What does that really mean to you? And we got a range of answers back, both from people here in China and around the world, which were remarkably consistent, actually, in terms of the words that they used. It was all about openness, honesty, transparency, truthfulness, sincerity. So these concepts came through very, very strongly. People also talked about integrity in business. They talked about companies that were true to their own values. So we took all of these definitions and then we boiled them down to what we called 7 essentials of authenticity. And that was everything from communicating honestly about your products and services, all the way down to being clear and true to your own beliefs as a brand. And then what we did was we tested those against a range of behaviors that you might traditionally expect from companies, such as innovation, product utility, having products that people can't live without, brand appeal, all of those kind of basics of marketing, if you want to put it that way. And so we asked people, of all of these things, what do you want the most? And here in China, and in fact, this was also true in the rest of the world, the authenticity measures, so the communicating honestly, the acting with integrity, the being true to your beliefs, all of those things basically came out at the top of the list. In fact, in China, there was only one behavior or quality which topped authenticity, and that was don't let your customers down, which was favored by, as the top, rated 89% in our survey. But right next to it was the clear need for integrity and clarity of belief in business. And then also communicating honestly about products and services. Very, very important to Chinese consumers. So clearly there's something going on there that people hadn't picked up on before.
Chinese consumers are also more demanding of their businesses. While 61% of global consumers think it's important that companies they purchase from reflect their personal values, what we see in China is that rises to 69%. Moreover, Chinese consumers are also more likely to follow business issues than their Western counterparts. Do you think that this is specific to F&B and tainted products that result in health scares, or perhaps in some cases of nationalism, in which consumers are looking at brands' country of origin? Or is it more widespread to other areas? Would you say Chinese consumers are disillusioned consumers?
Gosh, a lot of questions there. I'm not quite sure where to start. I'll start with the last one. Are Chinese consumers disillusioned? I would say the answer to that question is no. In fact, one big difference between the answers that we got in China and what we classify as some of the fast growth countries in our study, also including Indonesia, Hong Kong, places like that, is there was a lot less cynicism about brands, about what brands were likely to say to people than, for example, in Europe or North America. So, for example, in one of the questions we asked was, do you think big business is transparent and honest? And in the European countries, France, UK, Germany, and the US, Sweden, Spain, all of them, less than 3% of people there thought that businesses were transparent and honest. In fact, it was substantially higher in China and substantially higher in some of the other fast growth countries. So I would say that the Chinese consumers are much less cynical and disillusioned, and probably because China hasn't quite been through the same economic turmoil that we've had in the West. That's probably the main reason. So it is interesting to note that of all of the 12 countries that we surveyed, people in China were more likely to follow the news than almost anyone else, which I thought was certainly an interesting conclusion, and maybe not what you would have expected. In terms of the areas of concern, there's no doubt that food is top of the list of concerns. Food safety, food quality, and of course there have been a number of scandals here related to those subjects. And it's undoubtedly the case that consumers here, and that's definitely made an impact on the consumer here. There's a lot of concern about where the food comes from, is the brand telling me the truth about where this food comes from and what the products contains, and so that is top of the list. But it's by no means confined to that one subject. In fact, one of the interesting findings from this year is that there has been a big rise in China in the number of people who are concerned about data protection and data privacy. So this was something of a surprise to me. I think it was only the US that had a bigger concern about data privacy than China. So we can speculate as to why that might be, but clearly consumers here are aware that their information is being used by internet companies, it's been sold in certain ways, and they're concerned, I think, like many of us, that they're not entirely clear how that happens, what they're getting in return, and what information really is being passed on. So I thought that was interesting. But it's a range of issues that the Chinese consumer is concerned about.
Let's take a break to hear from our sponsor. Then we'll be back to hear more from Geoff Beattie. Welcome back. Let's talk about the Authenticity Report for a moment, which has a list of China's most authentic brands. Among the local companies, we see it dominated by banks and IT companies like ICBC, Bank of China, Lenovo, Huawei, China Unicom, and so on. The one exception here is Haier, which is an appliance company. What's holding back mainstream companies within the FMCG and food and beverage space that China has so many of from getting on the list? We see that it's definitely possible as we see companies and brands like Starbucks and KFC within the top 20 and actually #1 on the list.
Yeah, it's a good question, and one we've been considering since we got the results back. So it's important to say that what we did in terms of asking people about the most authentic brands, two things about that. First of all, it's not an exact science, so I think we're kind of developing this. Secondly, we did feel that people gave a considered answer because it came at the end of being asked about 20 questions about authenticity. So people were thinking about it when we said to them, okay, which company do you think represents authenticity? The third thing is that we didn't give them a list, so they just had to choose a name unprompted, which I think is a more genuine, or if you want to say more authentic answer, than giving people a list to tick from. And so we've been spending a lot of time thinking, well, why is KFC top of the list? Why is the Industrial and Commercial Bank #2? Why is McDonald's #3? And we can make some educated guesses. We probably have to do a little bit more research into why people gave those answers. But what I can say in terms of the food sector, you're absolutely right. The big local Chinese names are not on there. Why is KFC #1? Why is McDonald's #3? It comes down to, I think, this perception that Chinese food companies have a way to go in terms of really communicating with their customers about where the food comes from and the quality of the food, and giving people real information and real reassurances on that subject. Now, the Western brands have not been immune to that either. In fact, I believe there was something of an issue here over the summer to do with that, and they have to deal with the same issues. But I think the Chinese local FMCG brands are probably more affected by it than the foreign ones. So there's a way to go there. I think there's almost got to be a revolution, if you'll forgive me as a foreigner coming here saying this. There's almost got to be a complete transformation in the way that certainly food companies in China communicate with their audiences in terms of becoming much more authentic. And authenticity is really needed in that sector.
Do Chinese companies understand the need for transparency and authenticity, and how are they meeting this demand?
Again, it's a good question. We were having this discussion this morning with a very experienced brand marketeer in China. And he said the issue that we have here is that authenticity doesn't come naturally to Chinese brands, because there's a culture of needing to prepare everything beforehand, making sure that everything is scripted, and that you're really not kind of talking from the heart, so to speak. Now, Western companies do exactly the same thing. I don't think China is unique in that sense. And I would say, generally speaking, in my experience as a consultant, it goes against the natural instinct of companies to want to open up and become more open and honest and transparent and all those good things. It doesn't come naturally probably to any of us as individuals. So it takes a real effort, it takes real courage to say, we are now going to tell people information which we've never told them before. We're going to open up and tell them things that actually they might not like about us. That requires a real mind shift to be able to do that and to be able to understand why it's a good thing to do and to explain it to everyone around you that this is a good thing to do. Explain it to your bosses because you're going to be taking some risks. You know, when McDonald's, which is number one on our list of authentic brands around the world, they had a very interesting initiative where they said, ask us anything about what's in the food that we provide. Ask us any question and we'll answer it. And this was in North America. And they did. And they put all the answers on the internet, you know, all the things that bad people had said about McDonald's. And I think they got a real credit for doing that. So I think there are some good examples that not just Chinese companies, but many other brands around the world can learn from examples like that. Number 3 on our list is Apple, which again, if you dig into what's really happened inside that company since Tim Cook took over, they have actually made a conscious effort to become much more transparent as a business, especially when it comes to difficult news, controversial stories about their factories here in China. They've really grasped the nettle, as we say in the UK, and opened up about those subjects and tried to communicate much more honestly with people about them. But it doesn't come naturally to any company to want to do that.
Are there differences in how Chinese and Western consumers evaluate authenticity specific to Chinese brands? And are they judging them on the same criteria, or are stereotypes being brought into the different concerns? So
we don't see so far a great many Chinese brands featuring on our international authentic brands lists. That's something that hasn't happened yet. Even in other parts of Asia, we don't see those names appearing.
Were there any big surprises for you from the research in the way that Chinese consumers are scrutinizing Western brands in terms of authenticity, honesty, and transparency?
Yes, I was surprised at how well some of the big Western brands did in China. To be honest, I expected the list to be much more local than it was. So if you look at a comparable market, if anything can be comparable to China, I don't know if that's possible. If you look at Indonesia, for example, all of the companies, all the brands on the Indonesian list, almost all of them were Indonesian. And yet in China, it's a real mixture. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Is that a good thing? Is that a positive thing? Are Chinese consumers willing to really look at Western brands in a much more positive way? That seems to be the case. So the Chinese market presents lots of possibilities and opportunities, as long as they don't abuse the trust of the Chinese people that they seem to be willing to give.
Coming from the research space myself, I know the challenges of getting accurate information and consumer data anywhere, but especially here in China. Can you speak a little bit about the methodology in this report?
Yeah, it's always a challenge, and I can't claim that our study is an exact science. I think it points to some very interesting findings, and I think there's an awful lot in there that requires further investigation. What I would say is a couple of things about that. The fear is always that people are giving the answer that they think they should give rather than the answer that they really believe. So in other words, even though they might only care about having a shiny new smartphone and not about anything else, they know that the accepted answer is to say, well, I really care about a brand's ethics or a brand's integrity, so I'm going to give that answer rather than just say, well, I just care about the shiny smartphone. So you're always concerned about that, right? And I'm sure you find that in your own job. So how do you guard against that? One thing is sample size. So we have 12,000 people responding to this study around the world. And what amazed us was just the consistency of the answers. So if everyone's making it up, if everyone's giving the answer they think they want people to hear, then there's remarkable consistency about that. But I do think actually it is telling us something real. I think people are genuinely crying out for a different kind of relationship with brands, and it's coming through strongly in the study.
To close our conversation today, what's the key message that you think Chinese brands should bear in mind from your research? What's the key takeaway from the report?
Yeah, embrace authenticity. Really think about it. How can you build it into your brand strategy? It's not enough anymore to think about branding and marketing in the conventional or traditional way. You have to engage consumers in a much more open, honest, and what I like to say, mutually respectful conversation or relationship. People want to be treated as adults. And far too often, and what happens in an adult relationship, there's a two-way conversation, yes? And too often in terms of corporate communications and brand communications, it's a one-way flow. And that needs to change because the world has changed. You know, in this world of social media, you can't afford just to chuck messages out there and expect it to be accepted by people. That's not the world we live in anymore. So you've got to embrace authenticity. And as one of our clever colleagues likes to say, truth is really the only sustainable competitive advantage. I think that's quite a thought for people to take away.
Geoff, thanks for coming into our studio today.
Thank you.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Youku, Tudo, YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo, WeChat, Twitter, and join our LinkedIn group. See you again soon.